Okay, so here's a quick little tutorial on how to do French seams. As you'll see, I have two pieces of fabric here. This work is, you can do this with any type of fabric, but this is just a satin crepe here. And you'll see here that it clearly has a right side, which is what's facing up, and a wrong side, which is a little bit darker. So what I am going to do is I'm going to show you how to do the French seam. Some things you'll need your fabric, you'll need your sewing machine, some form of scissors. I have my fabric scissors and some embroidery scissors that I use to cut off threads and other things. And you will need an iron. In that case, you'll also need something to iron on. I have an iron mat just off this corner here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn these right sides out, and I'm going to place my fabric right sides together. So you'll see here, that's the right side here, or wrong sides together. Boop, 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 boop. Go back. All right, so I'm going to turn my fabric so that the wrong side is facing up, and then I'm going to place my fabric wrong sides together. So we're just going to do that. Make sure everything's aligned. And for the purposes of this, just have it as aligned as possible. And I'm working under the assumption that I have a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Actually, I'm going to work under the assumption that I have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm going to work under the assumption that I have a 5-inch seam allowance. So from here, you can use pins to hold these together, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to use clips. They just kind of help the fabric from not shifting. So I'm going to clip all of my fabric along the side. I'm only going to need a couple clips because this is such a short bit of fabric. And my sewing machine is already on and pre-threaded with fabric, with thread. And the matching thread for this fabric was already in the machine. So unfortunately, should I change the thread so that it's clearer? No, that's fine. All right, so I have my fabric threaded, wrong sides together, as you'll see here. And now I'm gonna take my machine, and all I'm gonna do is make a straight stitch along that. I'm actually gonna go less than 1/2 inch. I'm gonna go probably 1/4 of an inch because my total seam allowance is 1/2 inch. So I'm gonna go as close. I wonder if there's a good way to show you this. So I'm just gonna pull you forward and down a little bit. Maybe that's a better view. Who knows? Ooh, let's try that. Okay. So first things first, I always have this problem with my machine in particular, so I'm just gonna go ahead and put the thread in there, and we're gonna do, So on the foot that I am using, I'm using a zigzag foot, which is like your standard foot. There is a marker for the 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I'm just gonna line my fabric with the edge of that. And I'm gonna back stitch 1 stitch over, and I'm just going to sew a straight stitch 1/4 of an inch in. What's great is that if you have a habit, if you're trying to break the habit of not sewing over your pins, using clips instead is a great way to do that because you cannot sew them at all. Alright, so I'm just move that so it doesn't keep moving. And we're just gonna finish this up. right, so we have a quick little stitch that is 1/4 inch away from our seam edge. And I'm just going to clip off this excess thread just so that it's not in my way. It's already backstitched and everything, so it won't unravel on us. All right. Next step is we are going to take our ironing surface here. Let me put you back. All right. Nope. There we go. All right. So I have an iron that's already preheated for synthetic fabrics already to go here. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to just press the edge of that seam. You don't want to slide your iron back and forth over that because that can warp your stitches. Let's see, looks like I had some excess thread here. I'm just going to give that a quick snip. Great. So you want to press these as flat as possible, just along the seam that you already had. And then what you want to do is you want to fold your seam open. And the thing is, I personally prefer to press to one side rather than press the seams open. Because I've already pressed it to the side, I don't really have that concern. So what I'm going to do is I am going to just press this open to the side that it kind of wants to fall to a little bit. In this case, it's a smaller edge here. And I'm just lifting very slightly and pressing the seam. And we're going to do that on the other side so that the heat really, and this is heated for synthetic fabrics so that my fabric doesn't melt. You do want to make sure that you are paying attention to that, especially if you're using the synthetic fibers. Great. So what I'm going to do now is, this is now pressed flat and to one side. I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to cut the seam allowance here in about half so that it's down to about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So we're just going to carefully cut that. You do want to, this is as close as you're going to get without cutting into the seam while still having some leeway there. Great. So now I have roughly 1/8 of an inch seam allowance here. And then I'm going to take my iron again and I'm going to press it again. Just so that I can make sure it's all neat to one side. And if you need to, you can do a little baby steam. You don't need a lot of steam for this particular fabric. If you were using something a little bit hardier like a linen or something like that, some sort of steam would help. If you're using silk, do not use steam. All right, great. So now we have, this is the fabric on the right side. So this is the side that shows when you're done with your project. And we have the seam here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm now going to fold my fabric right sides together. And in this case, because I'm going to press this one last time before I sew it again, I actually do want to use pins. I personally always use silk pins for all of my projects. I just prefer how they feel. Sometimes if I have a lot of quick work, I can sew over them without worrying about them breaking. I do try not to sew over my pins, but you know, it happens, it happens. And there are some times where it's kind of hard to avoid. So I'm just pressing this all right sides together. And these silk head pins are glass heads, so I can iron them without being worried about them melting onto my fabric. If I would double check what type of silk pins you have before you iron over them. If they've got a plastic head, those are just going to melt and then you've ruined everything. You don't want that. So now that everything is right side together, I'm just going to do a quick little press here, just to make sure everything lays really flat. Pressing is 90% of sewing, so get used to doing a lot of pressing here. Great, so this is all pressed and ready to go. I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to take this and do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because you cut your seam allowance down to 1/8 of an inch, that seam should now be encased in your new stitch. So we're just going to do that real quick. And it's the same thing, so I don't think this needs to be viewed. You're going to place that along some sort of 1/4 inch marker or 1/4 of an inch marker here, and back stitch as always. I'm going to go slow because I want to take my pins out. Why aren't you moving forward? There we go. And I do like a tiny bit of tension when holding slinkier fabric so they don't shift and move around as much. And if you're new at this, do not be afraid to go slow. I'm going slow for the purposes of this, but I love French seams, so I can kind of knock them out pretty quickly. And don't forget, when you're ending a seam, to backstitch once or twice before finishing off your seam. There we go. Make sure that everything is up so you can clip that right off. All right, and put away your pins before you step on them. This big, massive pin cushion I got years ago from Amazon. Ow. I love this thing. Really hate stabbing myself with pins though. Yeah, so this is great because I do use a lot of different types of pins. There's some thicker guys up here that I use for other projects. My silk pins for when I'm sewing, and then when I do hand sewing, I have a bunch of hand needles as well. I keep my other like embroidery needles and such somewhere else. So. And our little fabric scraps, we are going to save in our fabric scrap box. All right. So, before I show you what this looks like from the inside and outside, I'm going to give this one last good old press. And with this polyester, I can once again get away with steaming it, but depending on your fabric, you do not want to steam it at all. All right, so now that that's done, this is what the fabric is going to look like from the inside. You'll see that there's a little seam here from your first seam. Do I have to be a booty guru? Okay. Look at that. So there's your first seam on the inside. And this is what your fabric is going to look like from the right side. I'm actually going to, just so you can see this a little bit better, I am going to press this to one side really quickly. And this type of fabric is actually perfect for French seams because you can see here on the edge that it frays very easily. So you want to make sure that all those fibers are encased to reduce the chance of them fraying and to keep your fabrics lasting longer. It is also a really nice seam finish to have on the inside because since everything is encased together, it's going to keep it nice and neat looking. All right, so here is the fabric from the outside. This is what it will look like with your final garment. Nice and neat seam here. Really beautiful. This is probably one of the better French seams I've done in a long time, personally. So thank you for this tutorial recommendation. And then here is the wrong side of the fabric. So you'll see that there's like a small amount here where you can see your old seam allowance is encased here based from the pressing. And then you'll see here that the edge of the seam is completely encased here within this second seam. So there is going to be no fraying once you have this project, and we have maintained that 1/2 inch seam allowance for the pattern. So you don't need to change your seam allowance or anything. You can just use the seam allowance that comes in the pattern. Some patterns do have seam allowances that are larger for front seams. I have found that just sticking with that 1/2 inch and making sure everything is down properly works out just fine. So you're still within the 1/2 inch seam allowance. Everything is neatly encased, and you'll see on the other side there is no fraying, there's no missed pieces here. So if you make sure you get everything cut down and pressed neatly, this is a pretty fail-safe way to have some enclosed seams. So thank you so much for watching this tutorial. If you want to see more, just let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, bye.